Aloha kako, aloha everyone. Welcome to our last session of the day. It is my pleasure and my honor to welcome Kayla Larson to Hoʻokele Naʻauao. So a group of us met Kayla back in 2017 when we were working on the Ithaca project on Naʻauao, and we visited her when she was up there at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. There was an unexpected snowstorm, I think, and it was a little cold for those of us from Hawaii. But Kayla and all of her friends were so welcoming, and we just were so glad to make that connection in 2017. I've seen Kayla a few times at different conferences over the years, but we were just talking about how, with COVID, it's been a little while since we've seen each other in person. If you don't know Kayla Larson, then you will soon. She is such an inspiration to all of us working in Indigenous librarianship. And for those of us working with Indigenous collections, her work around digital data sovereignty and her work around community connections and community control over our materials has been, again, like very inspiring. And so we wanted to close out today, Hoʻokele Naʻauao, with a talk about how we as Kanaka, how we here in Hawaii, and those of us who aren't Kanaka, can start to think about shifting our perspectives towards Indigenous worldviews. With that, I will say welcome, Kayla.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Okay, let's get started. Share my screen. Of course, I'm not sharing the right screen. There we go. Perfect. All right. So today, the talk that I'll be giving is called Lifting Our Hands, Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Protocols, specifically in Canadian libraries. But a lot of what I talk about Canadian libraries does transfer to other libraries. So just to start off, we always start off acknowledging the lands that we're on. And today I am joining you as an uninvited guest on the traditional territories of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam Nation, and also the shared territories of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in what's colonially known as Point Grey in Vancouver, Canada. And I'd like to thank the Musqueam Nation for hosting us, especially for hosting me and allowing me to work here and live here and learn from this nation as well. However, as you can tell, I'm not from Musqueam territory. So it's always good to locate ourselves and position ourselves so that you get to know me a little bit more as a person and as a librarian and an information professional. And so we also do this so that we can start to build those relationships between one another. So you can learn about my biases and you can acknowledge the position that I'm coming from and start to see those connections and relationships that I've already built within this room. And this is also like me reaching out my hand to you and saying, let's start having relationships with one another now. So when we position ourselves, we often ask things, or when we locate ourselves, we ask things like, who are your kin? So in my community, we ask Tante Otse Kia. So when we ask this, we're asking not just who your kin is, but where your belly button is connected to. So where does your umbilical cord connect to? Who are your matriarchs? Who are your mothers? Where are you from? So yes, looking at the lands also that you're from and your connection to your relations and the lands in that form. Additionally, when we ask this, it allows us to think of who we're accountable to, and it allows you to know who I'm accountable to. And additionally, it allows us to know a little bit more about the lands that we reside on now and our connection to the lands that we are currently on, even if those are not our home territories. So when I talk about locating myself, I'm Métis and Ukrainian, originally from Treaty 6 territory, so Miskwachi-Westnaigan, so Edmonton, the Beaver Hills. Specifically, I grew up in a small town called Tofield, Alberta. This is the territory of the Sartsi, Nehewak, Anishinaabe, Nakota Sioux, the Méchif, and the Blackfoot. These worldviews of these communities, specifically the Nihiwean, so the Cree and the Méchif folks, are what influence my worldviews. These are my worldviews and understandings. However, I am constantly learning from the Squamish, the Stolo, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations as I'm residing on their territories, and I'm learning a lot about their own protocols and how they view the land. So we can see here, just if you've never been to lovely BC. That is Squamish. That is the chief. That's the main kind of mountain that is at the base of the within Squamish territory. It's just around the bay from Vancouver, only about half an hour from actually where I live. It's an area that I hold very dear to my heart, and I very much so thank the Squamish Nation for allowing me to continuously climb up to the top of this mountain and take a moment to breathe and look at the Howe Sound and the mountains around it. So growing up in Amiskwaci and having that connection to Nehiyaw and Makeshift people, I bring in those worldviews, especially when it's talking about relationality and laws and governance models. So relationality is our connected to the land, the sky, humans and non-human beings. And these can be very complex relationships, and in some cases, not so complex relationships. So when I talk about Cree relationality, I look at Wahkotoan, so the interconnectedness of our relationships, as well as Miyawasituan, so having and possessing good relations with one another. And then also these connections are rooted in the concept of Pimatuasan, which denounce the good life or life itself. All of these concepts and these laws are related to also how we relate to the land and our accountability. So us today, in this virtual space, are building Wahkotoan and Miyawasituan with one another. And so there is actually a photo of the land that I grew up on. So the prairies, and this is taken just outside of Tofield where I grew up. So you can see the lands that I've grown up on are very different from one another, but I hold both of them very dearly to me. So being a librarian, an information professional, or an archivist, often we are handling research. We're engaging in research ourselves, or we're working with faculty, staff, and students to create research, to find research. And a lot of times this research intersects with Indigenous ways of knowing and being in many different ways. So when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges, and our understanding of Indigenous knowledges is very different than an academic understanding of what these knowledges are. When I go to my chapan, so my ancestors, I don't say, oh, did you know about these Indigenous knowledges? No, because these are just our knowledges. It's hard to describe in that sense. But in an academic way, we can say Indigenous knowledges have about 5 characteristics. They're personal, orally transmitted, experiential. So when I talk about the land, I can show you photos of the places that I go, of where I've grown up, but you can't actually experience the land that I'm from until you go there. All of your senses are not activated. You can't smell the fresh cut hay. You can't feel how pokey it actually is under your feet. You can't hear the sounds of what it's like to walk through a field. You actually have to be there. Additionally, it's holistic. It brings together the inner and the outer worlds, and its narrative. And when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges, often they're evolved from about 3 different things. So that's traditional knowledges, which are living chronicles, origins, trajectories, and achievements of Indigenous peoples. Empirical knowledges, so the careful observations of human to non-humans, and revealed knowledges. So sometimes these are revealed through dreams, visions, and intuitions. And then we have worldviews. So for worldviews, they're often holistic. There's many truths. Everything is alive. All things are equal. The land is sacred. Relationships between people and the spirit world are important. And then human beings are often the least important thing in the world when it comes to Indigenous worldviews. So Indigenous knowledges and worldviews often find themselves within research. But when we talk about research, research is really hard to have conversations with Indigenous folks, with our ancestors, our kins, our family members, because within Indigenous communities, often research is a very dirty word. Many of those who are part of our communities have been affected by colonialism and the legacy that research leaves behind. Research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. So really, it's hard for us, when being an Indigenous person, to see our own knowledges reflected in research, and often it being taken without permission. Additionally, research is a Western concept. Like I said, I'm going to my family, I'm talking about what I'm learning in school, what I do for work, and they don't often understand because it's not the same. We don't have words for things like research necessarily in Nahiawak or Nahiawan, so the Cree language. Concepts such as ontology, epistemology, and axology do not make sense when we're looking at Indigenous worldviews. So we can suggest different terminologies or different ways of thinking when it comes to research. Additionally, when we're talking about research within Indigenous communities, historically, research that has been done within Indigenous communities is not done in the way that it is now, with communities taking control of the research. There's a lack of consent, a lack of understanding in what can be shared and what cannot be shared. So protocols, things like that. As well as there's little community control on, or there was little community control on where data was to be stored, disseminated, or destroyed. A lot of research as well was deficit-based. So deficit-based research is when we're doing research and data collection within communities, and we're not focusing on things except for documenting and examining things like pain, trauma, and loss in communities, not respecting the voice of those who these narratives are coming from, and not looking at other narratives that could support the community. So as a librarian, we're often having to deal with these kind of research outputs. And then also within research, not only are we having our worldviews, but also we have knowledges and other cultural heritage objects that go into research. So some of these things are like Indigenous cultural expressions. So Indigenous cultural expressions can be like this button blanket. They often include things like traditional knowledge within them, but they differ. So because they are the tangible thing. They include things like dances, regalia, songs, etc. In the Canadian context, they're easier to cover under things like copyright law because it is the object. So the blanket, the design can be covered, but the knowledge that goes within why they chose this pattern, the significance and the meaning to the family or the clan, why specific shells are used, is not able to be covered under Canadian copyright law. Next, when we're thinking about knowledges and kind of things that go into research, we have biocultural and genetic resources. So these can be things like microorganism, plant varieties, animal breeds, genetic sequences, etc. And then lastly, we have traditional knowledges. And traditional knowledges, especially within a Canadian context, are the ones that we try very hard to protect, but often kind of face that wall with the government and with Canadian law, as Canadian law is based off of British common right law. So often traditional knowledges are the hardest for us to protect as Indigenous folk, but they're our most sacred knowledges and usually the most important knowledges within our community. So in general, there's no universally accepted definition of traditional knowledge, but it could be just kind of in a more narrow sense, kind of defined as knowledges that are resulting from intellectual activity in a traditional context, and it includes things like know-hows, practices, skills, and innovations. So that's kind of a very general overview over what a traditional knowledge is. And every community defines their own traditional knowledges in their own ways. So within the Canadian context, when we're looking at traditional knowledges and why they're so hard to protect, often expressions of traditional knowledges do not qualify for protection under Canadian copyright law because they are too old and therefore supposedly in the public domain. Additionally, when we're looking at Indigenous knowledges and traditional knowledges, the author of the material is not identifiable, and therefore there's no kind of rights holder in the usual sense of the rights holder. Additionally, with traditional knowledges, they're often collectively owned by Indigenous groups for cultural claims and not by individuals or corporations for economic claims. So this is kind of the reasons why they can be so hard to protect under Canadian copyright law. However, when we're looking at the cultural expressions, those are often a little bit easier to protect than the knowledges behind them themselves. Additionally, we face a few other kind of issues within Canada. So for those who might not be familiar with Indigenous folks in Canada, so we have 3 distinct groups of Indigenous folks in Canada under our Constitution, and that's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So within these groups, they all have diverse communities, languages, and knowledges, and they span to a certain extent from east, south, northwest, so the cardinal directions. So within these groups as well, there's recognized rights and non-recognized rights depending on which group you are from. They're all self-governing entities with different Indigenous governance systems and legal practices, as well as Indigenous lands and kin connections also expand beyond what is now known as Canada and the borders of what is now known as Canada. So we see this reflected often in Blackfoot communities or in Mohawk communities, where their communities actually expand into the United States and the borders down there. So we have a very complex and a very diverse group of folks up here in Canada. And so it can be harder to protect some of these knowledges, as many communities have very similar knowledges and claim those knowledges. And often folks are part of many communities. So you definitely have people that are First Nations, but they also have Métis ancestry, or folks that might be Inuit, but also have Métis or First Nations ancestry. So we are very diverse yet blended in some cases for a group. So with research and kind of knowledges, what they do is a lot of time inform data and Indigenous data. So Indigenous data, when I talk about it, really is a blanket term. And so when I'm looking in the library and I'm giving talks and I'm working with researchers and students, I'm talking about data. But data is like this huge blanket, especially Indigenous data, for many different things. So when I'm talking about Indigenous data, we can have data on Indigenous resources and environment. So this is like our land data, our water data, titles, and different information. And then we have data about Indigenous demographics, or what would be considered to be social data. So this could be health data, education, services, use of services, census, things like that. So that's our social data. And then data from Indigenous communities. So the demographic information can also be Indigenous created, but we also kind of separate it into data for or from Indigenous communities. So this is our cultural data, archives, oral literature, ancestral knowledge, and community stories. So really, Indigenous data is many different things. So before getting into data sovereignty, I wanted to talk a little bit about Indigenous sovereignty in general in Canada. And we know that Indigenous folks across the world, as per UNDRIP, have the right to be sovereign nations. It's something that's laid out within the United Nations Declaration. So we have the right to be sovereign. So Indigenous nations here in Canada and the Canadian state are both sovereign nations. This means that we are 2 separate governing bodies living on the same landmass. Arguably, we are 4 sovereign nations all living on the same landmass. So we have the Métis Nation, Inuit, First Nations, and then Canada, all remaining sovereign and living on the same landmass. The government of Canada recognizes that Indigenous folks have the right to remain sovereign and practice their self-governance through Section 35 of our Constitution here in Canada. So when we're talking about Indigenous self-governance in a Canadian sense, it is the formal structure through which Indigenous communities here are able to control and administer their people, lands, resources, and related programs and policies. And so this is done through agreements with government agencies and institutions on federal and municipal and provincial levels and territorial levels here in Canada. Oh, sorry, this is a re-thing. So thinking back to copyright. So this will become important when we're thinking about copyright and sovereignty. In Canada, copyright laws have allowed for the legal theft of Indigenous knowledges. And not only have they allowed for the theft of Indigenous knowledges, copyright law competes with the Constitution and Indigenous nations' allowing our Indigenous nations being able to remain sovereign in Canada. We are not able to control our own knowledges and the flow of our knowledges and step in and say it is inappropriate to replicate this knowledge. It is something that is not defined within copyright. There is a change, and activists and data activists and knowledge keepers that want to make this happen, but it is not there yet. We don't have a legal law in Canada that allows for the protection of Indigenous knowledges in the same way that copyright law is a legal law. So as an Indigenous information professional, the only thing that I can really do is advocate for Indigenous data sovereignty and principles of Indigenous data sovereignty to be upheld by other individuals working within this field. So Indigenous data sovereignty is the understanding that Indigenous nations have the right to ownership and governance of data about them, regardless of where it is held or who holds it. Indigenous nations also have the right to govern data in a way that aligns with their own data protocols and laws. And Indigenous folks also have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding. So this often includes things like access to government documents, both historic, contemporary, and archival documents as well. And I think, especially for Indigenous data sovereignty, the thing that is most important about this principle, regardless of where it is held and whom, over access and right and ownership, this is a kind of the concept that's most important. Yet it's a thing that really makes a lot of information professionals uncomfortable when I say that Indigenous nations have the right of ownership, regardless of where it is held and whom. That's a thing that usually makes people cringe, look the other direction, and just get really uncomfortable. And when we're talking about Indigenous protocols, it's really hard to break these down depending on where you're from, as many areas such as here in Vancouver can have many different protocols because there are many nations that claim different areas around here. But often when we're talking about Indigenous data protocols, we're looking at things like ownership and inheritance, so community, clan, families. Often Indigenous knowledges are earned, and it takes a really long time to earn knowledge. Data protocols can also be affected by age, gender identity, geography, season, and techniques. Often these protocols can use collective knowledges and follow Indigenous laws. So Indigenous data protocols are really important for Indigenous sovereignty, yet on an institutional level, in libraries, we can have a harder time implementing data protocols because we also interact with knowledges from so many different communities that can be hard to, consult with every community about what these protocols should be, that we should be adhering to when, being stewards of their knowledges and working with their knowledges in libraries and trying to uphold the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. So it can be very complex here in Canada for kind of interacting with data protocols and knowledge protocols when we have so many diverse communities here. So what about libraries? We've talked a little bit about libraries. I've been sprinkling it throughout. So I wanted to give some examples of libraries and kind of how we've, really messed up in the last couple of years or forever, continuously been messing up with what we do and how we engage with Indigenous folks, what we've gotten wrong and where we're going forward or what the future holds. Libraries and librarians have played many, many roles when it comes to especially things like colonialism. Arguably, libraries are agents of colonialism and continue to do so and act as colonial agents. We have made a lot of mistakes and we continue to make mistakes. I have attached here a letter of apology, a statement of apology from President Santa Ono, who is the president of UBC, for the harmful research that has been done over the legacy of UBC with Indigenous folks. Librarians are part of this. We steward knowledges that have been stolen. We continue to replicate harmful practices in research and data sharing through not being, when we are hosting things like data repositories that don't allow for communities to access their data. And especially when we're not speaking out within our institutions about harmful practices, we are still replicating colonial practices. And libraries, like I said, have been doing this for a very long time, not only academic, but public. I always like to give an example of kind of some of the ways in which libraries have, really been problematic towards Indigenous folks. So this is an article from Library Journal from 1935, and this is a context from the United States where it's a little bit of just backhanded comments about Indigenous folks and how Indigenous folks need to be taught to learn to walk the white man's road. And yeah, many cities and libraries don't even know that their readers are Indians, things like that. So, there is no problem of relationship between the public library and the Indian. There's no question that the library can do much to help the race travel on the white man's road. So obviously times have changed, but have they really, Additionally, this is about school libraries and being able to provide services for Indigenous children. This one's pretty bad. This one makes me very uncomfortable to read, especially they're talking, I won't really get much into detail, but the quote says, "As soon as I go into the classroom, I feel like slapping every one of their little brown faces, the dirty, evil-minded little imps." So it was the attitude towards Indigenous folks and Indigenous children and library services for them. So now that we've been reminded about the problematic practices and folks that have been there, mind you, yes, from the 1930s, but we still steward problematic information. So even if our practices are a little bit better and we're not going around saying that we're going to hit children anytime soon, we still steward problematic information. So if you're not familiar with what's been happening up here in what's now known as Canada, we have recently, well, I shouldn't say we have recently, Indigenous folks have always known that our ancestors, our children, have been buried on the sites of Indian residential schools. More recently, this has come into light with the discovery of 215 graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School here in BC. And now there is a mass kind of national scale search for missing children at the sites of residential schools. Here at UBC and specifically, we do steward some collections from the Sisters of St. Anne. And one of the things that we do have here is an MA thesis about the Sisters of St. Anne. So the Sisters of St. Anne specifically were the coven that ran the residential school in Kamloops. And so within our own circle collection, which is our open access collection about UBC materials, historic and contemporary, there is this thesis from 1962. So this is the description that's specifically from the thesis. So in the beginning, the need for the schools was to Christianize and educate all the children of the primitive Indians. The Sisters of St. Anne answered the call, and soon they were staffing schools, Duncan, blah, 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 blah. So this is the thesis description within the actual digital copy of this thesis. Within it as well, the Victoria Archives and the archivists were thanked within this thesis. And so we have this thesis that we are stewarding in our collection. We have a digital copy that is open access to our members, to our community users, to our relatives, those who are accountable for. And this description of this thesis is talking about educating the children of primitive Indians. Yes, we are taught this in archival practice that we need to use descriptions, and often we use descriptions that come straight from the original source, from the archival material. But do we need to continue to replicate that practice when it's using language, yes, inappropriate historical language, but using language that has the power to damage our communities, to damage relationships with communities, and to bring forth that reminder to communities about a lot of pain that they've suffered, rather than us, taking down this description, changing the description to be more reflective of what actually happened within these schools, or done so in consultation with the community on maybe how this description could be changed. Arguably, do we even need to show this is another thing. Should we maybe take this down and consult with the community on what should be done with this item? Another one that we look at is So our BC regional history, this is through the content management system, Islandora, and is through ARCA and BCELN. So we have, as information professionals, usually a good understanding of metadata, descriptive practices, RAD, so rules of archival description, curation, but how do we support patrons? How do we work with patrons and Indigenous communities to kind of change our practices and our worldview and our mindsets on this? There's a really great article that was written by one of my former colleagues, Christian Isbister, about the challenges of describing Indigenous archives and Indigenous archival collections, and how, as an Indigenous person, we often have to walk between these kind of two worlds, where on one hand, we want to be accountable to our communities. We are the ones that have been impacted by this. Often we're looking at, photos of places, right, like residential schools where our own family members might have gone. We're dealing with issues that impact our lives, such as the 60 scoop, MMIWG, so missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But on the other hand, as an information professional, we're taught things like RAD, which often conflicts with our own accountability to our communities and our own worldviews and understandings, and our own wanting to change description. And so this is a good example of it. And how I see this as an Indigenous information professional. This is from the site, the BC Regional History. So here in the title, it says Indian School. And yes, they're getting this from the actual description on the back of the photo. And we can see here, it's a photo in black and white. The excerpt from the item is that it is just beyond is the Indian residential school, blah, 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 fine brick structure. But here we can actually see that they are identifying it as the Kamloops Indian Industrial School. So it's not just an Indian school. It is the Kamloops Indian Industrial School from 1923. And then we go on to say, here the young Indian is instructed in the arts of the white man. And for me, I just laugh. Like, this description obviously was not done in a way that it should have been, but there are things we can pull out from here. So yes, there is that thing about communities have the right to say what should or shouldn't be public, but additionally, we have to make things findable for communities. If we are just putting Indian school, when we know from the description that it's the the Kamloops Indian Industrial School, we need to put that in so that our community members, our family members can find this information. So not only can they use it when they're doing things like looking for the burial sites, but they can tell us in some cases when things need to be taken down, or else we just don't know. So that is this one. And then also problematically that we often see is the rights. So that the rights and the copyright is to the museum and archive and not to the community. So when we're dealing with things like traditional knowledges, photographs of things like grave sites, harvesting areas, often the copyright goes to the museum or the person who took the photo and not to the community. So that's problematic in another sense. So that is, so what exactly do we do with this? And how do we start advocating for this? Well, often we take the community's direction. So when I was in Victoria, which is on Vancouver Island, it is our capital here in BC, I was walking past the Royal British Columbia Museum, and there was this big orange sign hanging outside that said, "Don't hide genocide, release the documents now." And this was hung up in protest of the Sisters of St. Anne archive, which was being stewarded by the Royal British Columbia Museum. And so the Sisters of St. Anne, because it's a private collection, they are allowed to dictate who has access and who does not have access to that archive. And so the Royal BC Museum with the province worked with the Sisters of St. Anne for them to allow for Kamloops band to actually access the archives. And there's talks about them opening, and a memorandum of understanding was signed for access to content about residential schools and to help along with the finding of the graves. But it took that advocacy from community members to say, we want access to these documents. We care about this. I think sometimes in information, with information professionals, there's this kind of really false dichotomy that Indigenous folks don't care, or that we don't understand, and that this is kind of a side thing. Indigenous people do care. We care about our knowledges. We care about our ancestors. We want to be active in working with these collections. So this is a really great way in which the community rallied around and said, we want access to these documents. And now a transformative change has happened wherein the documents are becoming more publicly accessible so that the work can continue to be done. So I kind of talked a little bit about this with the findability. So when looking at things like whether or not items should be open or restricted, often I look towards the work that has been done with our colleagues at GITA. So GITA is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and what GITA has done is created the FAIR and CARE principles. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So these are open access concepts. What they've done is they've taken FAIR and added CARE to it. So CARE stands for collective benefit, authority of control, responsibility, and ethics. So not only are we fair, but we need to care as well. And it is important to think about, especially when we are creating metadata or adding items into content management systems, that yes, in some cases, Indigenous folks do need to know exactly what we have in our collections so that we can consult with them, so that we can be ethical, and so that we can assign the appropriate restrictions or access protocols to it based off of Indigenous governance worldviews and laws. So we kind of had to work in both lenses, the FAIR and CARE. Additionally, what we can do is look at reciprocal data relations and workflows. So this is based off of the TK labeling that's come out of things like local context and the local context organization. And so we need to look at reciprocal workflows that work with communities so that we can allow for access to data and information and collections in a way that makes sense with them. So this is kind of what a reciprocal data workflow looks like as defined by local context. So we have communities, then we have users and collecting institutions. So we can still involve Indigenous protocols and worldviews into a reciprocal workflow with data and knowledge sharing, but it's just done in a way that's ethical, responsible, and is accountable for us to be accountable to communities to do things in a right way. So that's kind of what the data workflow looks like. And here are some kind of organizations that are also doing a lot of the work. So local context is usually the big one that I like to talk about. They do the traditional knowledge labels based off of the community. So they've also expanded. So local context has their TK labels, which are community assigned based off of worldviews and protocols. They now have cultural institution labels, which are attribution incomplete. So when we have metadata that's incomplete, we can assign it to a digital object to say that, we don't exactly have all the metadata or understanding around a specific item. Or now they also have the open to collaborate label as well. So that signifies to community members when we have things like photographs, theses, other knowledges that say we're ready to collaborate, we want to work with you, so that we can assign the appropriate traditional knowledge label to this digital item. Mercadoo is a great content management system to use when working with Indigenous knowledges and creating things like community-based archives and digital platforms. And it allows for tiered access to knowledges. So based off of the community's protocols around who should have access to what, and as well as it can be seasonal. So especially here on the coast and in the prairies where I grew up in Canada, seasons really do impact when knowledges can be shared, when stories can be told. Often the wintertime is storytelling time. And so it's really important within a digital platform that we can be allowed to adhere to those protocols. We can look towards WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, on traditional knowledge, and then also GITA again. And as knowledge professionals, I really think sometimes there's this culture of, I don't know, I'm going to do maybe a little bit about it, and then we'll get back to you. So this is something that I found while I was actually just exploring Ruckle Provincial Park on Salt Spring Island. And this is an example more towards public history and where there was not done enough by these public historians. And, you know, I understand it takes a lot of time and energy, and often as information professionals, we are easily burnt out. But in some cases, we're not able to actually, we're not upholding our end when it comes to reconciliation with communities when we're not doing things to the point that we should be. So this is about the first Indigenous residents on Salt Spring Island. So it's talking about the family, they're canoe makers, there's a photo of them. Interesting enough, the dog that's actually sitting on her lap, there's not anything written about this in there, but this is actually a type of a Salish dog, which was bred for its wool, and then they made blankets out of it. But there's nothing about that. The thing that really kind of hit home with me on this one is the very lack of getting into where this family is or the legacy of this family. So it just says in 1923, they disappeared. Perhaps they were removed as required by the Indian Act. And then their longhouse was burned. It's just like, they're gone. We don't know where they went. And then they burned the longhouse. So for me, this is not enough. We are not doing this family justice. We are not building reconciliation by using our privilege as information professionals, by looking into this, by working with the community to have more than just this tiny little sentence that they were just poof, gone. We don't know where they went. They burned their longhouse. Obviously, it's not that they were just disappeared. They didn't just disappear. This family deserves more. These are the original families of Salt Spring Island. Their legacy, we owe that to them. We're accountable to them to do more than just say they disappeared. That's not enough. So I've reached out to the Ruckle people that did this sign, and hopefully they will reach out back, and I'm sure that we can do a little bit more for the Salt family. And that's it for me. This is my contact. So Kayla.Larson@ubc.ca. Also, my Twitter is anti-librarian, and I do a podcast called the Book Women Podcast. I'd love to take some kind of questions, talk about some of the complexities around copyright, libraries, about repatriation of knowledge, rematriation of knowledge within communities, and have a bit of a larger discussion about it. So thank you. Hi. I will stop sharing my screen. No, what are we doing? Stop share. There we go.
Hi, Kayla.
Hello.
Thank you so much. I have 100 questions for you.
Okay, yay. All the questions. I know it's a huge topic. There's so many different things, and copyright law probably differs between where you are and where we are, and how we work with knowledges. And I think this is a thing that even when we come together, and you're talking about Hawaii, and you know how many languages specifically there are in BC. When we're talking about languages, there's 90. So Indigenous folks here are so diverse, and it's so complex just with the knowledges and languages and the sharing protocols between knowledges, that being a librarian up here and trying to work with those knowledges can be really, you feel it can take a toll on you some days.
And we were just talking about well-being in our last session, where we were also talking about you, actually.
I think I caught a little bit of that. There's an archivist conference happening here as well, so it's been a little bit of a bouncing back and forth day with archives and this, and archivists doing archives things. So
I have a quick question, and it's something related to the very last thing that you said. I think I heard you say repatriation and rematriation.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you could expound a little bit about that.
Right. So there's kind of this concept going around that it's not necessarily repatriation, but we should be using language like rematriation, as many communities, not all in Canada, depending on where you are, but out here on the coast, they're matriarchal societies. So we shouldn't be using terminology like repatriate. It should be rematriate, as we have matriarchs. We go by our matriarchs through clans and kin systems here. And even within my own community, often we look towards our matriarchs, our aunties, our cookums, our grandmothers. And so we should be using different terminology when we're talking about important things such as the returning of our cultural heritage, our ancestors, our knowledges to communities.
Mahalo. And now I have 100 other questions about gender within different communities and how that's expressed. That's the next webinar.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the last example you shared about the salt family.
Right.
And it just really illuminated for me that like our work affects identity, right? And our work affects sovereignty, individual sovereignty, collective sovereignty. And this is, this word sovereignty has come up over the past few discussions. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about Indigenous data sovereignty and how that affects individual, collective, political sovereignty.
That's such a big question.
Big question,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, especially when it comes to political sovereignty. So a lot of times here in Canada, we have nations that are trying to adhere their right to things like land, water, language, access to our medicines. So one thing that we often use is things like data, like archives, to prove that we have been here since time immemorial, to prove that these are our practices. But then we are often faced with things like restricted access to things like archives, where if I need a map or if I need a archival fawn that says, yes, my community has been on this land since prior to the Paoli, like it's a Paoli test case. It's a test case for rights in Canada that we have to adhere to say, yes, this is a thing that we do. If I need this, I then have to fill out paperwork with things like Library and Archives Canada, probably go to Ottawa or pay to have a digital copy, and they can say no. They don't have to give me access to that. So it is a highly political thing. With an archivist not allowing me to get access to my own knowledges from my community, that is highly political, and that is not allowing us to remain sovereign over our own knowledges, governance, laws, and also it ultimately denies us also a connection to an ancestor. Yeah. So if we're talking about things like archival documentation of things like mountains, waters, lands, we see those as being our ancestors. So when we're trying to adhere, trying to protect our ancestors, and we need that information that allows for that, and they're saying no, that is also highly political. And when it's talking about things like photographs of our ancestors and seeing the changes of that, that's denying us access to look at our ancestors as well. Or if it's something like a tree that's been felled, so cut down, we are not allowed to see that ancestor in photograph form.
Oh, and thank you so much for sharing about the context that you folks have, the political context that you folks have up in Canada. It's interesting that you folks, and it's inspiring for us that you folks have sovereignty and are recognized as a sovereign nation, and that just isn't the same here in Hawaii. And so we struggle, and I think that affects our library practices too, right? When we talk about repatriation and rematriation, the biggest question that comes up for me is just the logistical one: where would that happen? And who would they rematriate to?
Okay, so here's the other political, because you just said that. So here's another complex thing. So when it comes to knowledge sovereignty, it can be used against us, and has been. So what can happen here in Canada, because we are all sovereign nations, when it comes to shared territories, the government likes to do this little thing where they have other nations that might claim that land come in and be interveners on the other side. And we've seen that happen. And that's an act of lateral violence against each other, but it often does happen, where we can be interveners against each other in court cases over things like land rights, water rights. And it's highly problematic. But then that's when we rely on archival documentation to prove, yes, that we've been there. But in some cases, that archival documentation is not there, or it's been destroyed. We do know about archives being destroyed, or we just don't have access to it.
Or sometimes those records have been modified, right? By the person who's managing them.
Yeah. or they're not written from our context.
Right.
Honestly, like obviously most of the archival documentation that we have is written by white explorers, government agencies. So it's missing that kind of like community context. And just because, somebody went to Jasper, like in Alberta, and only recorded one nation was there, doesn't mean that other people weren't there either. It's just they maybe only saw one nation using that as a wintering spot at that time. And it doesn't mean that it was not continuously used by other folks as well. So
yeah. And you're talking a little bit about like silences and absences, which actually relates to one of the questions that we had during your talk. And so I think the question is around redescription. And does it feel like removal of history? Does it feel like rewriting of history for you?
I don't think it does, no. So when we're redescribing items, I think that's also a very highly political act. And it's us saying like, no, that's truth telling. When we are working with communities to redescribe things in the way that it actually happened, or by using people's actual names, it's truth telling. It's reclaiming that narrative over what's actually happening in this photograph, or what the actual context is between maybe the ceremony that's been recorded by an anthropologist 100 years ago. It's a way for us of saying like, no, this is actually what's going on. These are the names. These are the traditional place names. These are the people. These are the traditional names of the people even that are in this. This is the name of the ceremony. So it's a political act, and I don't think it's the erasing of history. I think it's an important act, and we can always do that also by having cross descriptions or adding additional descriptions. We can keep the original one but update it as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have 100 questions, and I will save them for the next webinar that we do together. I do want to wrap up with a final question though. I'm curious about sort of how you got into this work, given that there's so many aspects of Indigenous librarianship that need attention. I'm also curious about what keeps you here doing this work, and then curious about like, what are some of your immediate goals for this work? So that's 5 questions. Sorry, it's 5 questions.
5 questions. Okay, I'll try and answer them and remember what all of them are. So what keeps me here and doing the work is, one, the accountability to my community, my ancestors. My grandpa is a residential school survivor, as well as a Indian hospital survivor, like the tuberculosis hospitals. So my family and their stories keep me here, as well as every time I come up against something that's problematic within a museum, archive, or library, that keeps me here. It is very much so a privilege on our part, even as Indigenous folks, to have a master's degree, to have a PhD, and be here and doing the work. And often, like, when I go into community and I'm talking about data sovereignty and things like that, sometimes it's like completely over their head. They have no clue what I'm talking about, but occasionally you get that one person that really, like, it clicks in their head and they're like, no, that means a lot to me. That's my community's stories. I didn't know that UBC has this, or, you know, the Museum of Anthropology has this, and that I can't access it. Or Library and Archives Canada doesn't just let me walk in and like see my ancestors' stories. So it's that important work with connecting with communities and doing that heart learning. And a lot of it is heart learning that even I do on a daily basis. And yeah, so that's what keeps me going, I think. And also ceremony, like, I mean, that keeps you going too, just that connection with the ancestors. We were having a chat about sweat lodges earlier, so yeah, those kind of things. What was your other question? Totally got on a
No, that was the next question is, do you have some immediate goals that you're working towards in this area?
I mean, other than like completely changing Canadian copyright law and maybe getting a law degree, no. I think, you know what, the biggest thing that we can do, and some of my goals, is just getting more folks together to actually have these conversations with each other. Because I think even though we have very different contexts to where, like, how our communities fit into this, when we come together as Indigenous folks and we start saying like, no, like, I have the right to access my ancestor within an archive, when we come together as a collective, we're more powerful. Even if we have different understandings, even if we have different words to describe our knowledges, we have kind of like, when we come together, we can do more. So just getting folks together in a room, just chatting more with folks, yeah, dismantling the system, you know.
Give us the call and we're there. Let us know.
Yeah, pretty
Show
much.
up.
No, I was literally like, yeah. Anyways, I was like, no, they'll just like tell you the way that it is, and I love it.
Kayla, thank you so much again. You know, thought about the program for Ho'okele. You were literally the first person that I emailed. We were so excited about the idea of having you come and talk to us about your work, because this is just an area that we really want to grow in. And so yeah, Kayla, mahalo. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Hi, I lift my hands to you.
Mahalo. I am going to invite Siobhan and Anne-Marie to come back out here with me as we wrap up Ho'okele. I think for me, one of the things that I'm taking away from Kayla's session is heart learning. I hadn't articulated it in that way, and so I appreciate that she has shared that language with us.
Definitely, mahalo, Kayla. As we bring Ho'okele Naʻauao 2022 to a close, we hope you enjoyed today's presentations and conversations about the significance of ʻAina and the things that feed us, and our relationships to ʻAina as the places and environments and really the sources that feed us. Today's presentations highlighted the ways in which library and information science practices and systems in Canada and Aotearoa and here in Hawaii are growing to better support the stewardship of materials by, about, and importantly, for Indigenous peoples. And this will continue to be an ongoing conversation within libraries and increasingly with and led by our own Indigenous communities. And we hope that you will continue to engage in these conversations with us and also be inspired to pursue this work in whatever roles may be appropriate, in whichever institutions you work at or engage with, and in the communities that you belong to. And with this, I want to mahalo all of our wonderful presenters for sharing your experiences and expertise with us, and for sharing your time so generously. I see that some of you folks are still here, even despite the time differences. We appreciate you. Mahalo to the planning committee, Kiahiahi Long and Anne-Marie Paikai, and the tech assistants helping us in the background to make today as smooth as possible. Mahalo to IMLS for supporting this papohana. And mahalo to each and every one of you for joining in this year's symposium and sharing your time with us today. And of course, extend this mahalo to your ohana for supporting you in this learning and doing and sharing you with all of us today as well. So with that, I mahalo you, and I will hand it over to Kiahiahi to share some logistical notes.
So I've just got a few quick notes. So our sessions have been recorded today, and so we're going to edit them for public viewing, and then we'll share them with our panelists, and then we'll share them with the public, those that are appropriate to be shared. So be on the lookout for that, because we will send an email in a couple weeks. But more immediately, we'll send an email tomorrow thanking you for participating in Ho'okele, and also wondering if you folks have any reflections, suggestions, comments, takeaways that you would like to share with us. You know, this work is collaborative work, as Kayla just reminded us. This work takes many hands, and we hope that you folks engaging here today see yourselves in this work too. And so again, we're really interested to hear from you folks. And so we'll send a link to the evaluation, the session evaluation form tomorrow. Mahalo.
Aloha kako. And so just to close out, we're gonna pani with an oli. And this oli is e lonoe, and it is an oli that really speaks to the importance of our vai, but it also really speaks to the healing qualities of our vai. And we've really talked a lot about ʻAina today, being the sources and systems that really make up our ʻAina. And we would be remiss to not talk about vai as well, which has been a major theme for our project and a really beautiful metaphor to how the resources that we steward and care for have that healing aspect towards our communities. And so just wanting to pani with an oli that speaks to the living vitality of our vai and the importance of the work that we do with our resources and with our bringing back our communities to these places. So with that, we'll close. And after the oli is pau, feel free to jump off, and we hope to hear all of the feedback that you can provide with our evaluation. So mahalo nui. E lono e lono e lono kulani. E lono no I ka vai o olu oi ʻōina na oi hoʻina na te ole. O pue pue ana oi ka vai o la kane, ka vai o la kanaloi. I ka ikina i te tomohana i wai hua i wai lani e olo e. Mahalo nui a o kou pakahi a pau no ka hele ana mai ke ia la. And mahalo for joining us for Hoʻokele Naʻauao 2022. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Ahui ho.
Aloha. Aloha. Kayla, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I didn't look much at the chat, but when I did, it was just people, I caught something about tearing down statues and I wanted to be like, tear them down. We're really good at doing that here in Canada. Like, tear it down. Doesn't need to be there.
Oh, yeah, Kayla, again, anytime, right? Just call and we're there.
Yeah, will do. Yeah, it's tricky up here, especially like I said, like communities will like they will like fight each other for access to land up here. But it's like really apparent, especially when you look at how small our reserves are and how small our like land rights are compared to like other places.